Hi, guys, and welcome to Chapter 2 of Voyage of the Dawn Treader. I hope you enjoyed the adventure yesterday. I told you I'd loved Reepicheep. Isn't he awesome? I love that character. Okay, so this is Chapter 2, On Board the Dawn Treader. Ah, there you are, Lucy, said Caspian. We were just waiting for you. This is my captain, the Lord Drinian. A dark-haired man went down on one knee and kissed her hand. The only others present were Reepicheep and Edmund. Where's Eustace? Asked Lucy. In bed, said Edmund, and I don't think we can do anything for him. It only makes him worse if you try to be nice to him. Meanwhile, said Caspian, we want to talk. By Jove, we do, said Edmund, and first about time. It's about a year ago, by our time, since we left you, just before your coronation. How long has it been in Narnia? Exactly 3 years, said Caspian. All going well? Said Edmund. You don't suppose I had left my kingdom and put to sea unless all was well, answered the king. It couldn't be better. There's no trouble at all between the Telmarines, dwarfs, talking beasts, fauns, and the rest. We gave those troublesome giants on the frontier such a good beating last summer that they pay us tribute now. And I had an excellent person to leave as regent while I'm away. Trumpkin, the dwarf. You remember him? Oh, dear Trumpkin, said Lucy. Of course I do. You couldn't have made a better choice. Loyal as a badger, ma'am, and valiant as a mouse, said Drinian. He was going to be saying as a lion, till he had noticed Reepicheep's eyes fixed on him. And where are we heading for? Asked Edmund. Well, said Caspian, that's rather a long story. Perhaps you remember that when I was a child, my usurping Uncle Miraz got rid of 7 friends of my father's, who might have taken my part by sending them off to explore the unknown eastern seas beyond the lone islands. Yes, said Lucy, and none of them ever came back. Right. Well, on my coronation day, with Aslan's approval, I swore an oath that if once I established peace in Narnia, I would sail east myself for a year and a day to find my father's friends or to learn of their deaths and avenge them if I could. These are their names: the Lord Revellion, the Lord Byrne, the Lord Argos, the Lord Mavramorn, the Lord Octasian, the Lord Restamar, and the other one who's so hard to remember. The Lord Roop, sire, said Drinian. Roop, of course, said Caspian. That's my main intention. But Reepicheep here has an even higher hope. Everyone's eyes turned to the mouse. As high as my spirit, it said, through which, as small as my stature, though it is perhaps as small as my stature, why would we come to the very eastern end of the world? And what might we find there? I expect to find Aslan's own country. It is always from the east, across the sea, that the great lion comes to us. I say, that is an idea, said Edmund with an odd voice. But do you think, said Lucy, Aslan's country would be that sort of country, I mean, the sort you could ever sail to? I do not know, madam, said Reepicheep, but there is this. When I was in my cradle, a woodwoman, a dryad, spoke a verse over me. When sky and water meet, where the waves grow sweet, doubt not, Reepicheep, you find all you seek, there in the utter east. I don't know what it means, but the spell of it has been on me all my life. After a short silence, Lucy said, and where are we now, Caspian? Caspian can tell you better than I, said the captain can tell you better than I, said Caspian. So Drinian got out his chart and spread it on the table. That's our position, he said, laying his finger on it. Or was it noon today? We've had a fair wind coming from Cair Paravel and stood a little north for Galma, which we made on the next day. We were in port for a week, where the Duke of Galma made a great tournament for his majesty, and there he unhorsed many knights. I got a few nasty falls myself, Drinian. Some of the bruises are still there, said Caspian. And unhorsed many knights, repeated Drinian with a grin. We thought the Duke would be pleased if the King's Majesty would have married his daughter, but nothing came of that. Squints and has freckles, said Caspian. Poor girl, said Lucy. We all sailed from Galma, continued Drinian, and ran into a calm for the best of 2 days and had to row, and then had little wind again and did not make Terebinthia until the 4th day from the Galma. And there the king sent out a warning not to land, for there was sickness in Terebinthia. Guess we can all understand that right now. But we doubled the cape and put in at a little creek far up from the city and watered. That means brought fresh water on board ship. Then we had to lie off for 3 days before we got a southeast wind and stood out for the 7 islands. The 3rd day out, a pirate, Terebinthian by her rig, overhauled us, but when she saw us well armed, she stood off after shooting some arrows on either part. And we ought to have given her chase and boarded her and hanged every mother's son of them, said Reepicheep. And in 5 days more, we were in sight of Mule, which, as you know, is the westernmost of the 7 isles. Then we rode through the straits and came about sundown to Redhaven on the Isle of Bren, where we were very lovingly feasted and had victuals and water at will. We left Redhaven 6 days ago and made marvelously good speed, so that I hope to see the Lone Islands the day after tomorrow. The sum is, we are now nearly 30 days at sea and have sailed more than 400 leagues from Narnia. And after the Lone Islands, said Lucy. No one knows, your majesty, answered Drinian, unless the Lone Islanders themselves can tell us. They couldn't in our days, said Edmund. Then, said Reepicheep, it is after the Lone Islands that the real adventure begins. Caspian now suggested that they might like to be shown over the ship before supper. But Lucy's conscience smote her, and she said, I really must go see Eustace. Seasickness is horrid, you know. If I had my old cordial with me, I could cure him. Oh, but you have, said Caspian. I'd quite forgotten about it. As you left it behind, I thought it might be regarded as one of the royal treasures. So I brought it. If you think it ought to be wasted on a thing like seasickness. It'll only take a drop, said Lucy. Caspian opened one of the lockers beneath the bench and brought out the beautiful little diamond flask, which Lucy remembered so well. Take back your own, Queen, he said. They then left the cabin and went out into the sunshine. On the deck there were 2 large, long hatches, fore and aft of the mast, and both open, as they always were in fair weather, to let light and air into the belly of the ship. Caspian led them down a ladder into the after hatch. Here they found themselves in a place where the benches for rowing ran from side to side, and the light came in through the oar holes and danced on the roof. Of course, the captain's ship was not at all a horrible thing, a galley rowed by slaves. Oars were used only when the wind failed, or for getting in and out of harbor, and everyone, except Reepicheep, whose legs were too short, had often taken a turn. At each side of the ship, the space under the benches was left clear for the rowers' feet. But all down the center there was a kind of pit which went down to the very keel, and was filled with all kinds of things, sacks of flour, casks of water and beer, barrels of pork, jars of honey, skin bottles of wine, apples, nuts, cheeses, biscuits, turnips, sides of bacon. From the roof, that is, from the underside of the deck, hung hams and strings of onions, and also the men of the watch off duty in their hammocks. Caspian led them aft, stepping from bench to bench, lest it was stepping for him, sometimes more of a step and a jump for Lucy, and a really long jump for Reepicheep. In this way they came to the partition with the door on it. Caspian opened the door and led them into a cabin, which filled the stern underneath the deck cabins in the poop deck. It was, of course, not so nice. It was very low, and the sides sloped together as they went down, so there was hardly any floor. And though he had windows of thick glass, they were not made to open because they were under water. In fact, at this very moment, as the ship pitched, they were alternately golden with sunlight and dim green with the sea. You and I must lodge here, Edmund, said Caspian. Pause it for just a second. We'll leave your kinsmen the bunk and sling hammocks for ourselves. I beseech your majesty, said Drinian. No, no, shipmate, said the Caspian. We have argued about that out already. You and Rince was the first mate, are sailing the ship, and will have cares and labors many a night when we are singing and catching stories. So you and he must have the port cabins above. King Edmund and I can lie very snug down here. But how is the stranger? Eustace, very green in the face, scowled and asked whether there was any sign of the storm getting any less. Caspian said, "What storm?" And Drinian burst out laughing. "Storm, young master," he roared. "This is as fair a weather as a man could ask for." "Who's that?" said Eustace irritably. "Send him away. His voice goes through my head." "I brought you something that'll make you feel better, Eustace," said Lucy. "Go away and leave me alone," growled Eustace. But he took a drop from her flask, and though he said it was beastly stuff, the smell in the cabin when she opened it was delicious. It was certain that his face became the right color in a few moments after he swallowed it. And he must have felt better, because instead of wailing about the storm in his head, he began demanding to be put ashore, and said that the first port he would lodge a disposition against all of them with the British Council. It's kind of like the people in charge of, in foreign countries for the affairs of a country. But when Reepicheep asked what a disposition was, means a complaint, and how you lodged it, Reepicheep thought it was some new way to arrange single combat. Eustace could only reply, "Fancy not knowing that." So Eustace is kind of making Reepicheep feel stupid. Uncool. In the end, they succeeded in convincing Eustace that they were already sailing as fast as they could toward the nearest land they knew, and that they had no more power of sending him back to Cambridge, that's in England, which is where Uncle Harold lived, than of sending him to the moon. After that, he sulkily agreed to put on fresh clothes which had been put out for him, and come up on deck. Caspian now showed them over the ship, though indeed they had seen most of it already. They went up on the forecastle and saw the lookout man standing on top of a little shelf inside a gilded dragon's neck and peering through its open mouth. Instead, the forecastle was a galley, or the ship's kitchen, and the quarters for such people as the boatswain and the carpenter and the cook and the master archer. If you think it odd to have the galley in the bow, imagine the smoke from the chimney streaming back over the ship. This is because you're thinking of a steamship, where there's always a headwind, which means like a ship that's powered by an engine, it's pushing forward. So it would be silly to have, the kitchen with its fires in the front, because then the smoke would all rush back over the ship and everyone would be coughing over the fumes. But since this is a sailing ship, the wind is always coming from behind, and it's going to push the smoke forward out in front of the ship instead. On a sailing ship, the wind is coming from behind. Hey, didn't I just say that? And anything smelly is put as far away as possible. They were taken up to the fighting top, and at first it was rather alarming to rock to and fro, there see the deck looking small and far away beneath. You realized that if you fell, there was no particular reason why you shouldn't fall on board rather than in the sea. Then they were taken to the poop deck, where Rince was on duty with another man on the great tiller, and behind the dragon's tail rose up, covered with gilding, and round it ran a little bench. The name of the ship was Dawn Treader. She was only a little bit of a thing compared with the ones of our ships, even with cogs and dromons and carracks and galleons, which Narni had known when Lucy and Edmund reigned there under Peter the High King, for nearly all navigation had died out in the reign of Caspian's ancestors. When his uncle Miraz the usurper had sent the 7 lords to sea, he had had to buy a galleom ship and man it with hired galleom sailors. But now Caspian was beginning to teach the Narnians to once more be seafaring folk, and the Dawn Treader was their finest ship he had built yet. She was so small that forward of the mast there was hardly any deck room between the central hatch and the ship's boat on one side, and the hen coop, Lucy fed the hens, on the other. Now, why do you think they might have hens? Maybe so they could all have fresh eggs from time to time. But there was a beauty in her kind, a lady, the sailors would say. Her lines perfect, her colors pure, every spar, rope, and pin lovingly made. Eustace, of course, would be pleased with nothing, and kept on boasting about the liners and motorboats and airplanes and submarines, as if he knew anything about them, muttered Edmund. But the other 2 were delighted with the Dawn Treader, and when they turned aft to the cabin and supper, they saw the whole western sky lit up with an immense crimson sunset, and felt a quiver of the ship and tasted the salt on their lips and thought of unknown lands on the eastern rim of the world. Lucy felt she was almost too happy to speak. You always ask if there are pictures. There is one picture that I'm going to show you of the Dawn Treader. This is at the front of the book. Yay, the Dawn Treader. So that's what the boat looks like. And then, of course, we've got the illustration on the front, too. That's more just a picture. What Eustace thought had best be told in his own words. When they all got their clothes back, dried the next morning, he at once got out a little black notebook and a pencil and started keeping a diary. He always had this notebook with him and kept records of his marks on it. For though he didn't care much about any subject for its own sake, he cared a great deal about marks and would even go to people and say, "I've got so much, what did you get?" And these are like grades. So he's bragging about his grades. But as he didn't seem likely to get many marks in the Dawn Treader, he now started a diary. Can't speak. This was the first entry. August 7th. Have now been 24 hours on this ghastly boat, if it isn't a dream. All the time, a frightful storm has been raging. It's a good thing I'm not seasick. Huge waves keep coming in over the front, and I have seen a boat nearly go under from a number of times. All the others pretend to take no notice of this, either from swank or because Harold says one of the most cowardly things ordinary people do is shut their eyes to the facts. It's madness to come out onto a sea with a rotten little thing like this, not much bigger than a lifeboat. Of course, absolutely primitive indoors, no proper saloon, no radio, no bathrooms, no deck chairs. I'm dragged all over it yesterday evening, and it would make anyone sick to hear Caspian showing off his funny little toy boat, as if it were the Queen Mary. I tried to tell him what real ships were like, but he was too dense. E and L, Edmund and Lucy, of course didn't back me up. I suppose a kid like L doesn't realize the danger, and E is buttering up C, Caspian, as everyone else does here. They call him a king. I said I was a Republican, but he had to ask what that meant. He doesn't seem to know anything at all. Needless to say, I've been put in the worst cabin on the boat, a perfect dungeon, and Lucy's been given the whole room on deck to herself. Almost a nice room compared with the rest of the place. C says it's because she's a girl. I tried to make him see what Alberta says, that all the sort of things that really lowering girls, but he's too dense. See, still, he might see that I will be ill if I'm kept in that hole any longer. E says we mustn't grumble because C is sharing it with us himself to make room for L, as if it didn't make it more crowded and far worse. Nearly forgot to say, there's also a frightful mouse that keeps giving everyone a most frightful cheek. The others can put up with it if they like, but I shall twist his tail pretty soon if he tries it on me. The food is frightful, too. The trouble between Eustace and Reepicheep arrived even sooner than might have been expected. Before dinner the next day, when the others were still rounding the table waiting, being at sea gives one a magnificent appetite, Eustace came rushing in, wringing his hands and shouting out, "That little brute half killed me. I insist on it being kept under control. I could bring an action against you, Caspian. I could order to have it destroyed." At the same moment, Reepicheep appeared. His sword was drawn. His whiskers looked very fierce, but he was as polite as ever. "I ask your pardon all," he said, "and especially Her Majesty's. If I had known that he would take refuge here, I would have waited a more reasonable time for his correction." "What on earth is up?" said Edmund. What had really happened was this. Reepicheep, who never felt that the ship was getting on fast enough, loved to sit in the bulwarks far forward, just beside the dragon head, gazing out at the eastern horizon, and singing softly in his little chirruping voice the song that the Dryad had made for him. He never held on to anything, however the ship pitched. He kept his balance with perfect ease. Perhaps his long tail hanging down on the deck inside the bulwarks made this easier. Everyone on board was familiar with this habit, but the sailors liked it because when one was on lookout duty, it gave someone to talk to. Why exactly Eustace had slipped and reeled and stumbled all the way forward to the forecastle? He had not yet gotten his sea legs. I never heard, Perhaps he hoped that he would see land, or perhaps he wanted to hang out around the galley and scrounge something. Anyway, as soon as he saw the long tail hanging down, and perhaps it was rather tempting, he thought it would be delightful to catch hold of it, swing Reepicheep around by it once or twice upside down, and then run away and laugh. At first, the plan seemed to work beautifully. The mouse was not much heavier than a large cat. Eustace had him off the rail in a trice, and very silly he looked, thought Eustace, with his little limbs all splayed out and his mouth open. But unfortunately, Reepicheep, who has fought for his life many a time, never lost his head even for a moment, nor his skill. It is not very easy to draw one's sword when one is swinging around in the air by one's tail, but he did. And the next thing Eustace knew, he had 2 agonizing jabs in his hand, which made him let go of the tail. The next thing after that was that the mouse had picked itself up again, as if it were a ball bouncing off the deck. And there it was facing him, and a horrid, long, bright, sharp thing like a skewer was waving to and fro within an inch of his stomach. This doesn't count as below the belt for mice in Narnia, because they can hardly be expected to reach any higher. "Stop it!" spluttered Eustace. "Go away! Put that thing away! It's not safe! Stop it, I say! I'll tell Caspian! I'll have you muzzled and tied up!" "Why do you not draw your own sword, poltroon?" cheeped the mouse. "Draw and fight, or I'll beat you black and blue with the flat." "I haven't got one," said Eustace. "I'm a pacifist. I don't believe in fighting." "Do I understand," said Reepicheep, withdrawing his sword for a moment and speaking very sternly, "that you do not intend to give me satisfaction?" So Reepicheep is challenging him to a duel. "I don't know what you mean," said Eustace, nursing his hand. "If you don't know how to take a joke, then I shan't bother my head about you." Does Reepicheep think it's a joke? No. "Then take that," said Reepicheep, "and that to teach you manners and respect due to a knight and a mouse's tail." And at each word he gave Eustace a blow with the side of his rapier, which was thin, fine, dwarf-tempered steel, and as supple and effective as a birch rod. So he didn't, stab him. He was hitting him with the side of the sword. Eustace, of course, was at a school where they didn't have corporal punishment, so the sensation was new for him and a complete novelty. That was why, in spite of having no sea legs, it took him less than a minute to get off the forecastle and cover the whole length of the deck and burst in at the cabin door, still hotly pursued by Reepicheep. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that the rapier was well, and the pursuit was hot. It might have been red hot by the feel. There was not much difficulty in settling the matter once Eustace realized that everyone took the idea of a duel quite seriously, and heard Caspian offer to lend him a sword, and Drinian and Edmund discussing whether he ought to be handicapped in some way to make up for him being so much bigger than Reepicheep. He apologized sulkily and went off with Lucy to have his hand bathed and bandaged, and then he went on to his bunk. He was careful to lie on his side, because he had been hit with the rapier. Okay, chapter 3 is called The Lone Islands. So that's what we're going to look at tomorrow. Love you guys. Hope you have a good day, and we'll talk to you later.